Boomers often get blamed for killing the American dream.
Let's be real for a second. Boomers did have it easier. We all know that.
Boomers really are the most out of touch and entitled generation there is, and it's not even close.
And the argument is usually this. Boomers grew up at the height of the American dream, but throughout their lives, we've seen this dream slowly unravel to reach today, where the cost of living is high, the job market is broken, and individualism runs America. But the question is, did boomers really kill the American dream, or are they just the scapegoats? Because while that argument holds some validity, it fails to address what happened between these 2 points. What events unraveled that killed this dream and reshaped society into what we see today? Well, in this video, I want to answer that question, because although it might begin with prosperity and end in hardship, the chaos that unfolds in between makes you understand how we ended up getting here. And once you hear this story, you can decide for yourself if boomers actually killed the American dream or they're just the scapegoats. Now, in order to understand how it all started to unravel, we need to go back to the beginning when the boomers were born, right after World War II, with Chapter 1, The Birth of the Boomers. Now, to understand the boomers, we first need to understand their parents. These were the generations shaped by war, either fighting on the front lines themselves or growing up in a world consumed by war. They came of age in a time of hardship and scarcity where life demanded cooperation. People lived modestly, trusted authority, and focused on the greater good. But once the war ended and peace came, everything shifted. They left an era of hardship and scarcity and entered an era of comfort and abundance. And once they entered this new era, they were longing for normalcy, and many of them married young and started to have tons of kids, ushering the birth of the baby boomers, who would become the largest generation in history, spanning from 1946 to 1964. And this new generation was being shaped in a world that was very different from their parents. Thanks to low-interest loans from the GI Bill, many people could afford homes in the safe car-dependent suburbs. The GI Bill also sent more people to college, fueling the rise of a strong middle class. With the world rebuilding and dependent on American goods, families could live comfortably on a single income. And with wartime rationing over and TVs in every living room, advertising fueled a culture of consumer spending. For the first time in a while, things were starting to look up, and this is the childhood that many boomers were born into. However, it's important to note that not everyone reaped the benefits of this new era. Like black families not receiving the same post-war benefits, women being forced back into domestic roles, and rural Americans being left behind. However, for the people that did, this was an era of conformity. Everyone lived in the same cookie-cutter house, drove the same cookie-cutter car, and used the same credit cards to buy the same stuff. And in response to all this, boomers were starting to develop their own identity, and they didn't value conformity as much as their parents, and started to reject traditional values, write their own music, and create their own subcultures. Like every generation in history, they were responding to their own challenges, rather than the challenges of the generation before. Yet despite all this prosperity, deep cracks were starting to form in society. Children practiced duck and cover drills as the Cold War was in the background. The civil rights movement was underway as African Americans were fighting for equality. And America was deep at war in Vietnam in attempts to stop the spread of communism. As the boomers were coming of age, America was changing rapidly. It was no longer this post-war utopia, but it was a nation facing its next set of problems. And by the 1970s, it became clear that these old solutions wouldn't work anymore. And that was the beginning of a new era. Chapter 2, the 1970s, America in Decline. Now, when people think of the 1970s, they think of disco, free love, and rock music. However, economically, this was a painful decade in America, and this was the decade that the boomers were coming of age. By the end of it, they would be between 16 to 34. Boomers were confronting a lot of challenges that would end up shaping them throughout this decade, and the first challenge was the Vietnam War. Unlike the wars their parents fought, this was a war that really divided people. What started off as a war to fight the spread of communism progressed to burning draft cards, deadly college protests, and images on TV that many Americans disapproved of. And by the time the US left Vietnam in 1973, it marked the first ever war the US lost. And it was the first time when people wondered if they could trust their government. And that mistrust only deepened with the Watergate scandal in 1972, where Nixon's re-election campaign was caught spying on the Democratic Party, and the president tried to cover it up, eventually leading him to resigning to avoid impeachment, again, making people lose trust in their government. Throughout the 70s, trust in the government was starting to decline, and also at the same time, people were starting to view their government as incompetent. In 1973, OPEC imposed an embargo on the US for supporting Israel, which quadrupled the price of gas and created gas shortages and long lines at the pump, making people extremely angry. And that frustration even deepened more in 1979. Due to the Iranian Revolution, there was another gas shortage, which again created long lines at the pump and increases in prices.
This is the second gas line this morning.
What happened at the first one?
They ran out.
And in both lines over an hour, and I'm out of gas. Dead out.
There's no shortage. I don't believe there's a shortage.
And with this energy crisis, President Jimmy Carter was urging people to conserve energy by wearing sweaters indoors, and even did a famous speech telling the public, "We have a crisis of confidence."
There's a crisis of confidence. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future.
All of these events, one, made America seem weak, and two, made people lose confidence that their government could solve problems. And at the same time, the post-war economic boom was starting to decline as other countries were rebuilding their economies. And by 1970, the US was met with something called stagflation, which is a mix of slow economic growth, high unemployment, and high inflation, something economists didn't think was possible at the time. I mean, inflation was out of control in the 70s, hitting double digits multiple times. And so many boomers were coming of age in the worst economy since the Great Depression, seeing their savings diminish because of two-digit inflation, not having their paychecks keep up, and also with interest rates over 15%, homeownership became impossible. And of course the 70s wasn't all bad, but on the ground level, people were frustrated and struggling. And you pile up all of these things, Vietnam, questionable leadership, energy shortages, and stagflation, and you get an America that is desperate for something new. And that is when one man rose, promising a new vision for America. Chapter 3, the Reagan Revolution. By the 1980s, boomers were adults. By the end of this decade, they would be between 26 to 44. And by this time, the world was very different than the one they grew up in, and America in general was ready for something new. And that is when this man appeared, Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan was no ordinary politician, but he was a former Hollywood actor and the governor of California. And because of that, he was a master communicator. He knew how to talk to the public, inspire confidence, and project optimism. And by the 1980 election, while Jimmy Carter had spoken of sacrifice and crisis, Reagan spoke of hope, freedom, and a new America. Reagan's message was something that was very unheard of at the time, and it was this.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
And for a country in decline, something about him and his message really resonated with people. And in 1980, he won in a blowout election, winning 44 out of 50 states. And this is a point in history where many historians mark a turning point in American politics, where we went from this New Deal liberalism of government is the solution to the rise of modern conservatism of free market is the solution. And Reagan's policies impact how everything works today. First, when it came to the economy, Reagan wanted to unleash the free market, later called Reaganomics, which was centered on cutting taxes, which he cut the highest tax bracket from 70% to 28% in 8 years. Reducing government regulation to help businesses grow, cut government spending on welfare programs, and boost defense spending. And at the same time, the Fed declared a war on inflation, increasing interest rates to 20%. Reaganomics believed that if people and businesses kept more of their money, they would invest, spend, and create growth that would trickle down to everyone else. And when this plan played out, there was some pain in the beginning. In 1982, unemployment peaked at 10.8%, leading to a recession. Mortgage rates reached 15 to 18%, making it hard to buy homes. And many factories and farms closed. But a few years later, on a macro level, things did start to improve. By 1983, inflation started to stabilize. The stock market was increasing after decades of stagnation. Unemployment was falling, and the GDP was growing. Compared to the disaster of the 70s, things were starting to get better, and Americans as a whole seemed to be happy with Reagan. And it's important to note that he was a master communicator, and people didn't just like his economic policies. But some people liked him because he had messages that just resonated with the public. Like in the '84 election, his famous ads spoke about morning in America and captured America's progress.
It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
However, Reagan is a very controversial figure, and his success is dependent on your political beliefs. And many of his critics mention that these tax cuts widened inequality. He tripled the national debt in his presidency. He pursued controversial foreign interventions. Welfare structures weakened, and deregulation would create many irresponsible practices later on. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, America was a different place. At least in that moment in time, it was a lot more prosperous than it was in the previous decade. And that prosperity, at least in the short term, would continue. But so would the hidden cracks beneath all that prosperity. Chapter 4, The Age of Easy Money. By the 90s, boomers were no longer kids, but they were professionals, homeowners, and leaders, living in a world that was very different from their parents. And by the turn of the decade, on a macro level, things were starting to get better. The Cold War was ending, the economy was booming, inflation was under control, and the stock market was soaring. And that was partially due because of the rise of easy money. Credit cards were easy to get, and borrowing was cheap. The 90s was the longest economic expansion in the history of the United States. And with that expansion came a culture of excess. Boomers, many in their peak earning years, were buying bigger houses, driving bigger cars, and filling their lives with more stuff than ever before. And consumer debt skyrocketed as people were spending beyond their means. I mean, the average credit card debt increased by 53% from 1990 to 2000. And all this deregulation was continuing to fuel the rise of easy money. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 that separated commercial banking, investment banking, and insurance was repealed in 1999, which allowed banks to merge and become financial giants, and could take bigger risks than ever, fueling a culture of speculation. And also, these Reagan-era policies were forcing Democrats to lean more to the right, and we started to see things like the Personal Savings and Work Opportunity Act signed by Clinton that further embraced this idea of personal responsibility and less welfare. However, of course, not everyone benefited during this time. With the rise of NAFTA and globalization, many factory jobs were outsourced overseas and factories closed, destroying the town's economy and leaving many people out of work. However, at the same time, consumer goods became cheaper, fueling more consumerism. But beneath this prosperity, the cracks were forming. Wealth was becoming more concentrated, income was stagnant for the middle class, debt was becoming normalized, giving this illusion of prosperity and making people keep up with the Joneses, and speculation was at an all-time high. On the surface, the 90s seemed like this golden age, but beneath that prosperity was debt, inequality, and speculation that was pushing America closer to the edge. And as the new millennium began, the illusion of prosperity all came crashing down. Chapter 5, The Great Squeeze. Despite how great the 90s seemed, a lot of that prosperity came from easy money and speculation. And by the 2000s, boomers were either entering their peak earning years or getting ready to retire, but they would face many setbacks in this decade. The first setback they would face was right at the turn of the millennium with the dot-com bubble, where many people believed that the internet was the future, poured billions of dollars into companies that never produced a profit, and in 2000 the bubble burst, and the stock market crashed and many people's 401ks vanished on paper. Then came the next crisis in 2001, when there was an attack on the World Trade Center, which reshaped policies and war brought the nation further in debt. And in response to this, the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates, and cheap money would once again flood the economy, fueling a housing bubble, where banks would give mortgage loans to anybody who asked, which increased the prices of homes. But despite that, wages remained stagnant in the 2000s, while the cost of living climbed, leading many people to lean on using debt to afford life. However, again, that easy money would later create a crisis. In 2008, millions defaulted on their mortgages and lost their homes, and boomers, many of whom were nearing retirement, watched their home values plummet, their 401ks get cut in half, and their job security vanish overnight, while the government bailed out Wall Street. And at this point, the squeeze hasn't stopped. The cost of housing, education, and healthcare has exploded. Wages have stagnated. Debt from student loans to credit cards have become a way of life, and inequality continues to climb. And the truth is, for the average boomer, these crises haven't put them on top of a mountain victorious, but they've been in the weeds alongside other generations who are barely making ends meet. They're not villains to this story, but many of them are victims of the system that they've watched evolve throughout their lives, who are now worried about their future as they're slowly being pushed out of the workforce. And so I want to finish this video off with Chapter 6, Where Do We Go From Here? Alright, another deep dive story in the books. As I said in the beginning of this video, when it comes to boomers, many people focus on their start and ending points. However, the real story lies in between these 2 points. And as we've seen in this video, that story is incredibly dense. We went from the post-World War II boom to their coming of age in economic turmoil, to a new rhetoric reshaping America, an age of prosperity, and finally many busts that shape the world that we live in today. And so the question is, what do we do with all this information? Well, I think that if there's just one thing this story teaches us, it's that the American dream has never been this fixed promise, but it's always been this moving target, shaped and reshaped by each generation's choices, struggles, and values. And so instead of telling you what to think or believe, I want to finish this video telling you 3 takeaways that I took away from researching this video. 1. History is a chain of events. One thing that I've been learning as I've been creating these historical video essays is that every decision is built off past decisions. Nothing happens in a vacuum, but history is a domino effect. In this story, World War II created prosperity. Prosperity created new challenges. Those challenges reshaped political rhetoric. That rhetoric reshaped America, and each shift set off the next. History isn't about who caused what, but it's about how each moment creates the next. 2. Human beings are always human beings. So while I was doing the research for this video, I watched a lot of clips of old local news stories, where they go out and just ask random people on the street how they feel.
People talk, but they ain't doing nothing. You know, it's the same old thing every day.
So you don't think talking's going to do it tonight?
I don't think so, sir.
And watching these clips made me realize that human beings do not change at all. The only thing that changes about us through the decades are our hairstyles and the outfits we wore. Everything else is the same. People have always been driven by the same instincts: desire, fear, and status. We've always wanted to get ahead, to own nice things, and to feel secure. And throughout history, we always fight, complain, and get swept up in whatever politics promised us the easier life. But yet somehow, we never really get it. But that's just who we are, and we have to accept it. And finally, the world has been burning since it's been turning. Doing the research for this video made me think a lot about the song "We Didn't Start the Fire" by Billy Joel. And if you haven't heard the song, it's basically this non-stop list of crises and events that unfolded throughout Billy Joel's life, from Harry Truman to the Coke Wars. And Billy Joel wrote that song when he was 40, after talking to a 21-year-old who was telling him how hard times are now and it was easier in the past. And it got him thinking how each generation thinks that the time that they're living in is the worst, and they romanticize the past. But as we've seen in this video, when you look at the past, the world has been burning since it's been turning. And the truth is about generations is that every generation inherits problems it didn't create and passes down new ones it rarely intends. Thank you so much for watching. These videos require a lot of work, so if you enjoyed it, please give it a like, subscribe for more videos like it, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. And if you want to hear another very interesting story about how the 401k killed the pension, give this video a watch next. And with that, muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día, nos vemos chicos.